The scream that tore through the November night of 1884 carried across the frozen plains outside Cripple Creek, Colorado, with enough force to wake Lucian Jameson from his bedroll beside the dying campfire. He shot upright, hand already on his revolver, heart hammering as he scanned the darkness beyond the circle of amber light. The temperature had dropped below freezing after sunset, and his breath formed clouds in the air as he listened intently for whatever had made that sound. When it came again, he realized it was not a scream at all but the desperate wailing of an infant, piercing and insistent against the stillness of the mountains. Lucian was on his feet in seconds, pulling his coat tighter as he moved toward the sound with cautious steps. His horse, Shadow, stamped nervously at the edge of camp, ears pricked forward. The crying grew louder as Lucian approached a rocky outcropping about 50 yards from where he had made camp for the night. What he found there made his chest tighten with a mixture of concern and disbelief. A woman sat huddled against the rocks, her arms wrapped around a bundle that could only be the source of the crying. She was shivering violently, her dress torn and mudded, her dark hair hanging in tangled waves around her pale face. When she looked up at him, her eyes were filled with such exhausted desperation that Lucian felt something shift inside his chest. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Please help us." Lucian did not hesitate. He holstered his gun and knelt beside her, immediately shrugging out of his heavy wool coat and draping it over her shoulders. The baby's cries had reached a frantic pitch, the small face visible within the blankets red and contorted with cold and hunger. "Come on," Lucian said firmly, already reaching to help her stand. "My camp is just over there. I have a fire and food. Can you walk?" She nodded weakly and tried to rise, but her legs gave out beneath her. Without a word, Lucian scooped her into his arms, careful not to jostle the baby too much. She was lighter than she should have been, all sharp angles and trembling exhaustion. He carried her quickly back to his campsite and settled her as close to the fire as he dared, then immediately set about building up the flames with more wood from his supplies. The baby continued to cry, the sound cutting through Lucian like a knife. The woman tried to soothe the child, rocking him gently, but her movements were weak and uncoordinated. Lucian grabbed his spare blankets from his pack and wrapped them around both mother and child, creating a cocoon of warmth. "When did you last eat?" he asked, already pulling out strips of dried beef and a canteen of water. "Yesterday morning," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the baby's wailing. "Maybe the day before. I lost track." Lucian handed her the water first, watching as she drank deeply before offering some to the baby, who was too distraught to take it. The infant's cries had become hoarse now, desperate and exhausted. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at her son. "He's so cold," she whispered. "I tried to keep him warm, but I couldn't. I just couldn't." Something in her voice, in the defeated slump of her shoulders, struck Lucian deeply. He had been riding alone for 3 years now, keeping to himself, avoiding entanglements. But looking at this woman and her suffering child, he found he could not maintain that distance. "Let me hold him," Lucian said quietly. She looked up at him with surprise and uncertainty. "What? Your baby? Let me hold him while you eat something and warm yourself. You cannot help him if you collapse from exhaustion and hunger." Her arms tightened around the bundle instinctively, a mother's protective reflex. But then she looked at Lucian's face, really looked at him, and whatever she saw there must have reassured her because she slowly, carefully, transferred the crying infant into his arms. The baby was so small, so impossibly fragile in Lucian's calloused hands. He held the child against his chest, tucking the blankets more securely around the tiny body. The baby's cries continued, but Lucian began to walk slowly around the fire, rocking gently, murmuring low words that were more sound than sense. "Eat," he told the woman firmly. "Build your strength back up." She obeyed, tearing into the dried beef with shaking hands while Lucian continued his slow circuit around the fire. He had never held a baby before. The closest he had come was helping deliver a foal once, and that was hardly the same thing. But something instinctive took over as he cradled the child against his chest, using his body heat to warm the small form. "There now," he murmured. "You are safe. I have got you. Your mama is right here and you are going to be just fine." The baby hiccuped and squirmed, the cries gradually becoming less frantic. Lucian kept walking, kept rocking, kept talking in that low, steady voice. The woman watched him with an expression he could not quite read, exhaustion and gratitude and something else mingling in her dark eyes. "What is his name?" Lucian asked softly. "Thomas," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm canteen. "Thomas Edward." "That is a strong name. How old is he?" "3 months, nearly 4 now." Lucian looked down at the small face, red and pinched with cold and distress. 3 months old and already facing the brutal reality of frontier life. He felt anger stir in his chest at whatever circumstances had led this woman and her baby out into the wilderness alone in November. "And what is your name?" he asked, looking up at her. She hesitated for just a moment, as though considering whether to trust him with even that small piece of information. "Grace," she said finally. "Grace Evans. Lucian Jameson," he replied. "And you can trust that I mean you and your boy no harm, Miss Evans." "Mrs.," she corrected quietly, then added, "or I was. My husband is dead." The words were spoken flatly, without emotion, but Lucian heard the grief underneath. He did not press for details. Instead, he continued his slow walk around the fire, feeling the baby's cries gradually diminish to whimpers, and then to soft, hiccuping breaths. Thomas's tiny fingers had worked their way free of the blankets, and now clutched at Lucian's shirt with surprising strength. "I think he is warming up," Lucian said. "His crying has calmed." Grace nodded, finishing the last of the dried beef. "Thank you. I did not know what else to do. We have been walking for 2 days, and I ran out of food yesterday. I was trying to reach Cripple Creek, but I must have gotten turned around in the dark." "Cripple Creek is about 10 miles west of here," Lucian told her. "You were heading north instead." Her face crumpled slightly. "I thought so. But in the dark, with no moon, I could not tell which way to go. And Thomas was crying so much, and I was so tired." "You are safe now," Lucian assured her. "Get some rest. We will figure out what to do come morning." But Grace shook her head. "I cannot ask you to do more than you already have. You have been so kind, but this is not your burden to carry." "Maybe not," Lucian agreed, looking down at the baby in his arms. Thomas's eyes were starting to droop, the tiny face relaxing as warmth and exhaustion combined to pull him toward sleep. "But I am carrying it anyway. No woman and child should be out here alone in the cold." He continued to walk, continued to rock, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I will hold him till he sleeps," he said, more to himself than to Grace. "Then we will get you both warm and fed and figure out the rest in daylight." Grace's eyes shimmered with tears. "Why are you helping us?" "You do not know anything about us. We could be trouble. I could be running from the law or worse." Lucian met her gaze steadily. "Are you?" "No," she said firmly. "I am just trying to survive, trying to give my son a chance at life." "Then that is all I need to know," Lucian replied. They fell into silence then, with only the crackle of the fire and Lucian's soft murmuring filling the night. Thomas's breathing had evened out, the small body relaxing completely against Lucian's chest. The baby was asleep, finally, the long lashes dark against the round cheeks. "He is out," Lucian said quietly, carefully lowering himself to sit beside Grace. Poor little fellow was exhausted. Grace reached out tentatively, her hand hovering over her son's head before she gently stroked the fine dark hair. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." Lucian looked at her in the firelight. Even exhausted and bedraggled, there was a quiet strength to her features, a determination in the set of her jaw. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, he guessed, though hardship had left its marks around her eyes and mouth. "How long since you lost your husband?" he asked gently. 6 weeks, Grace said, her voice catching. "He was thrown from his horse while trying to break a wild mustang, broke his neck. He was dead before I could reach him." "I am sorry," Lucian said, meaning it. Grace nodded, blinking back tears. "We had a small homestead about 40 miles east of here. But after Robert died, his brother came and claimed that the land was rightfully his since Robert and I were not legally married. He said Robert had promised him the property and I had no proof otherwise. He gave me 3 days to leave." Anger flared in Lucian's chest. "Did you go to the law?" "The law in that town is his friend," Grace said bitterly. "They looked at me, a woman with a baby and no marriage certificate because the circuit preacher had not made it to us yet, and they told me I had no claim. So I packed what I could carry and started walking." "Where were you planning to go?" Cripple Creek. "I heard they were looking for women to work in the boarding houses and restaurants. I can cook and clean and sew. I thought maybe I could find work there, find a place for Thomas and me to stay." Lucian looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms. Such a small, helpless thing to be caught up in the harsh realities of frontier justice. "You will find work," he said firmly. "I know people in Cripple Creek. I will make sure you get a fair chance." Grace looked at him with such gratitude, and hoped that Lucian felt something in his chest tighten uncomfortably. He had been alone for so long, had told himself he preferred it that way after what had happened in Kansas. But holding this woman's child, seeing the desperate relief in her eyes, he felt something long dormant stirring to life inside him. "You should sleep," he said, clearing his throat. "I will keep watch and hold Thomas so you can rest properly." "I cannot ask you to do that," Grace protested, though her exhaustion was evident in every line of her body. "You are not asking, I am offering. When is the last time you slept for more than an hour?" She hesitated, then admitted, "I do not remember." "Then sleep now. You are safe here." "I promise you that." Grace looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly and lay down beside the fire, pulling the blankets around herself. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened and evened out. Lucian sat with the baby cradled against his chest, feeding the fire with his free hand to keep the flames high and bright. The night was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that sank into your bones and stayed there. He could hear coyotes howling in the distance and the occasional hoot of an owl. Shadows stamped and snorted occasionally, but otherwise the night was still. He looked down at Thomas, so small and vulnerable in his arms. What kind of world had this child been born into, where his father could be taken in an instant and his mother turned out of her home with nowhere to go? Lucian knew the frontier could be cruel, had experienced its harsh justice himself. But holding this baby, feeling the tiny heartbeat against his chest, he felt a fierce protectiveness rise up inside him. When dawn finally broke over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Lucian was still awake. Thomas had stirred a few times during the night but had settled quickly, each time with gentle rocking. Grace slept on, her face relaxed and peaceful for the first time since Lucian had found her. He carefully transferred the baby back to his mother's arms, tucking the blankets around them both. Grace stirred but did not wake, instinctively pulling Thomas closer. Lucian stood and stretched, his back protesting from the hours of sitting in one position. He fed Shadow and then set about making coffee and cooking the last of his bacon over the fire. The smell of food woke Grace about 20 minutes later. She sat up slowly, blinking in the morning light, momentarily disoriented before her eyes focused on Lucian. "Good morning," he said, offering her a tin cup of coffee. "How do you feel?" "Better," she admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "I cannot remember the last time I slept through the night." She looked down at Thomas, who was still sleeping peacefully. He did not wake, once or twice, but he settled quickly. "I think he just needed to be warm and secure." Grace's eyes filled with tears again. "You stayed awake all night holding him," Lucian shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I have done night watch plenty of times. It was no hardship." But they both knew it was more than that. He had given Grace something precious, a night of rest, of safety, of not having to carry everything alone. She looked at him with an expression that made Lucian's heart skip a beat. "I have bacon cooking," he said, breaking the moment. "You should eat before Thomas wakes up hungry." They shared breakfast in companionable silence, the morning sun gradually warming the air. Thomas woke as they were finishing, and Grace nursed him while Lucian politely turned his attention to breaking down his camp. "We should reach Cripple Creek by early afternoon if we get moving soon," he said. "Can you ride?" "I have ridden before," Grace said, "though not recently." "You and Thomas can ride Shadow. I will walk alongside." "I cannot take your horse," Grace protested. "You are not taking him." "I am lending him to you. There is a difference." Grace opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. "Thank you," she said simply. They set out within the hour, with Grace sitting astride Shadow with Thomas bundled against her chest. Lucian walked beside them, leading the horse by the reins. The terrain was rough, all rocks and scrub brush with mountains rising in the distance. But the weather held clear and cold, and they made good time. As they traveled, Lucian found himself asking Grace about her life, and she opened up gradually, telling him about growing up in Missouri, meeting Robert at a church social, their decision to head west to claim land under the Homestead Act. She spoke of her dreams for a better life, of the small cabin they had built together, of the garden she had planted. "I loved it there," she said wistfully. "For the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something that was truly mine, ours, and then it was just gone." "You will build again," Lucian said firmly. "Maybe not in the same place, but you will have a home again. I am certain of it." She smiled at him, and Lucian felt that strange tightness in his chest again. Grace Evans was beautiful, he realized, but it was more than that. There was a resilience to her, a quiet strength that drew him in despite his best efforts to maintain distance. "What about you?" Grace asked. "What brought you to Colorado?" Lucian was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to share. "I worked as a ranch hand in Kansas for several years," he said finally. "But there was trouble with the ranch owner's son. He was stealing cattle and blaming it on the hired help. When I figured it out and confronted him, he tried to kill me. I shot him in self-defense, but his father did not see it that way. I left before it could turn into something worse." "That must have been difficult," Grace said softly. "It was necessary," Lucian replied. "Sometimes the frontier does not offer good choices, just necessary ones." They fell into silence again, but it was comfortable now, the silence of two people who were beginning to understand each other. Thomas dozed against his mother's chest, content and warm. As the sun reached its zenith, the rough trail they had been following merged with a more established road. Other travelers appeared, heading to and from Cripple Creek. Lucian kept a watchful eye on everyone they passed, but most were miners or merchants, too focused on their own business to pay much attention to a man, a woman, and a baby. When they crested the final hill and Cripple Creek came into view below them, Grace drew in a sharp breath. The town was larger than she had expected, sprawling across the valley with wooden buildings lining several streets. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, and even from this distance they could hear the sounds of industry and life. "There it is," Lucian said. "Your new start." Grace looked down at Thomas, then over at Lucian. "Our new start," she corrected gently. "I could not have made it without you." They descended into town in the late afternoon, drawing curious glances from the residents. Lucian led them directly to a boarding house run by a woman named Martha Sullivan, a widow in her 50s who had a reputation for fairness and kindness. Martha took one look at Grace and Thomas and ushered them inside without hesitation. "You poor dear," she said, already directing Grace toward a chair by the fire. "You look half frozen and exhausted. Let me get you some hot tea and something to eat." Lucian hung back, suddenly uncertain of his place in this scenario, but Grace reached out and caught his hand. "Please do not go," she said quietly. "Not yet." So he stayed, sitting awkwardly in Martha's parlor while the older woman fussed over Grace and Thomas. Martha listened to Grace's story with increasing indignation, her mouth pressed into a thin line. "That is shameful," she declared when Grace finished. "Absolutely shameful, but you are here now and we take care of our own in Cripple Creek." She turned to Lucian. "You did right bringing her here, Mr. Jameson." "I just did what anyone would have done," Lucian said uncomfortably. "Nonsense," Martha said briskly. "Most men would have ridden right past. You are a good man and do not let anyone tell you otherwise." She turned back to Grace. "Now, as it happens, I am in need of help here at the boarding house. I have 8 rooms, all currently occupied by miners and merchants, and I am getting too old to handle all the cooking and cleaning myself. If you are willing to work, I can offer you a room, meals, and a small wage." Grace's face lit up with hope and relief. "I would be honored, Mrs. Sullivan. I am a hard worker, I promise you that." "I do not doubt it for a moment," Martha said warmly. "You can start tomorrow after you have had a chance to rest properly. For now, let me show you to your room." As Martha led Grace upstairs, Thomas still cradled in her arms, Grace looked back at Lucian. "Will you be here when I come back down?" she asked. "If you want me to be," Lucian replied. "I do," she said simply, then disappeared up the stairs. Lucian sat in the parlor, feeling oddly out of place and yet reluctant to leave. He had delivered Grace and Thomas safely to Cripple Creek, had seen them settled with good work and a place to stay. His obligation was fulfilled. He could collect his horse and ride out, continue his wandering existence without attachments or complications. But when Grace came back downstairs an hour later, her hair brushed and her face washed, wearing a clean dress that Martha had loaned her, Lucian found he had no desire to leave at all. "Thomas is sleeping," she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. "Martha has him in a proper cradle in our room. I cannot tell you what a relief it is to see him safe and warm." "I am glad," Lucian said, meaning it. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Then Grace leaned forward, her dark eyes serious. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "All right," Lucian said warily. "Why did you help us? Really? You do not know me, you do not owe me anything, so why did you stay up all night holding my baby? Why did you bring us here and make sure we were settled?" Lucian considered the question, trying to find words for something he did not fully understand himself. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "Because when I heard your baby crying in the cold, I could not walk away. Because looking at you, exhausted and desperate but still fighting for your son, I saw something worth protecting." Grace's breath caught. "Lucian," she whispered. "I know it has only been a day," he continued, the words coming faster now. I know you just lost your husband and you are trying to build a new life. I am not asking for anything from you, Grace, but I would like permission to stay in Cripple Creek for a while, to see you settled properly, to make sure you and Thomas are truly safe. You would do that?" Grace asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I would," Lucian said firmly, "if you will let me." Grace stood and crossed to where he sat, then slowly reached out and took his hand. "I would like that very much," she said. "You are a good man, Lucian Jameson. The kind of man I thought no longer existed in this world." Lucian stood as well, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of her hand in his. "I am just a man, Grace, nothing special." "You are wrong about that," she said softly. "You are very special indeed." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then Martha's voice called from the kitchen, breaking the spell. "Mr. Jameson, will you be staying for supper? I am making stew and there is plenty." Lucian looked at Grace, a question in his eyes. She smiled and squeezed his hand. "Please stay," she said. "I would very much like you to." So he stayed for supper, and then he rented a room at another boarding house just down the street. And the next day he found work at the livery stable, tending horses and repairing tack. It was honest work, and it kept him in Cripple Creek, close to Grace and Thomas. The days turned into weeks, and Lucian found himself falling into a routine. He would work at the livery from dawn until mid-afternoon, then walk over to Martha's boarding house where Grace would be finishing her duties for the day. They would sit in the parlor, or, when the weather permitted, walk through the town with Thomas bundled against the cold. Grace was an excellent worker, and Martha praised her constantly. The boarding house had never been cleaner or more efficiently run, and Martha's guests were all impressed with the quality of the meals. Grace was building a reputation, making friends, becoming part of the community. And every day, Lucian fell a little more in love with her. He watched the way she tended to Thomas with such gentle devotion, singing softly to him as she rocked him to sleep. He saw how she treated everyone with kindness and respect, from the rough miners who boarded at Martha's to the shop owners on Main Street. He learned that she loved reading, that she had dreams of one day owning a small restaurant, that she missed the garden she had planted at her old homestead. For her part, Grace seemed to bloom in Cripple Creek. The haunted, desperate look gradually faded from her eyes, replaced by a quiet contentment. She smiled more, laughed more, and she always seemed happiest when Lucian was near. One evening in early December, about 3 weeks after they had arrived in Cripple Creek, Lucian and Grace were sitting in Martha's parlor after supper. Thomas was playing on a blanket on the floor, grabbing at a wooden rattle that one of Martha's guests had carved for him. The baby was growing quickly, his cheeks filling out, his eyes bright and alert. "He looks so healthy now," Lucian observed, watching Thomas with a smile. "Thanks to you," Grace said softly. "If you had not found us that night, I do not know if either of us would have survived." "Do not think about that," Lucian said, reaching over to take her hand. It had become natural between them, these small touches, these moments of connection. "You are both here and thriving. That is what matters." Grace looked down at their joined hands, then up at Lucian's face. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Anything," he replied. "I have been thinking a lot about Robert lately," she began, and Lucian felt his heart sink. "About our life together, about what we had." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Robert was a good man. He worked hard and he loved Thomas and me. But if I am being honest, our marriage was more about practicality than passion. We were friends who decided to build a life together. It was comfortable and safe, but it was not grand or all-consuming." She looked directly at Lucian now, her eyes intense. "What I feel when I am with you is different. It is terrifying and exhilarating all at once. When you look at me, I feel seen in a way I never have before. When you smile, my heart races. And I know it has only been a few weeks, and I know I should still be in mourning, but I cannot help how I feel." Lucian's breath caught in his throat. "Grace," he managed. "I am falling in love with you, Lucian Jameson," she said, her voice steady despite the tears shimmering in her eyes. "And I needed you to know that, even if it is too soon, even if you do not feel the same way. I just could not keep it inside anymore." Lucian stood abruptly, pulling Grace to her feet as well. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "Grace, I have been in love with you since that first night when I saw you fighting so hard to protect your baby. Every day since then has only made it stronger. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I would be honored beyond measure if you would let me be part of your life." "Part of Thomas's life?" "Yes," Grace whispered. "Yes, absolutely yes." And then he was kissing her, gentle and reverent, pouring all his feelings into that moment. Grace kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together. "Mr. Jameson," Martha's voice came from the doorway, and they jumped apart guiltily. But the older woman was smiling. "I think it is about time you made an honest woman of Grace. This is a respectable establishment after all." Lucian and Grace looked at each other and laughed. "Mrs. Sullivan is right," Lucian said, still holding Grace's hands. "I do not have much to offer you right now, just honest work and a heart that is completely yours. But if you will have me, Grace Evans, I promise to spend every day for the rest of my life making you and Thomas happy." "That is all I could ever want," Grace said, tears streaming down her face now. "You are all I could ever want." Thomas chose that moment to let out an imperious cry from his blanket, demanding attention. They both laughed, and Grace bent to scoop him up, settling him on her hip. The baby looked between them with his wide, dark eyes, as though sensing something important had happened. "What do you think, Thomas?" Grace asked her son. "Should Lucian be part of our family?" Thomas grabbed a fistful of Lucian's shirt and pulled, making a happy gurgling sound. Lucian laughed and gently extracted his shirt from the baby's grip, then leaned down to kiss Thomas's forehead. "I will take that as a yes," he said. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity and happiness. Lucian and Grace were married in a simple ceremony at the small church in Cripple Creek, 2 days before Christmas, with Martha and several of the townspeople in attendance. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Martha had helped her make, and she carried a bouquet of pine branches tied with ribbon. Thomas, now 4 months old, dozed peacefully in Martha's arms during the ceremony. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Lucian kissed Grace with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. This was what frontier marriages should be, they whispered to each other. Based on genuine love and respect, not just convenience or necessity. Lucian had been saving his wages from the livery, and with that money plus what Grace had earned at the boarding house, they were able to rent a small cabin on the edge of town. It was not much, just 2 rooms and a loft, but Grace cried with joy when Lucian carried her over the threshold. "It is perfect," she said, looking around at the bare wooden walls and simple furnishings. "Absolutely perfect." They made it a home quickly. Grace hung curtains she had sewn herself and arranged their few possessions with care. Lucian built a proper cradle for Thomas and a rocking chair for Grace. He also surprised her by building raised garden beds outside, ready for planting come spring. "You remembered," Grace said with wonder when she saw them. "Of course I remembered," Lucian replied, pulling her into his arms. "You told me how much you loved your garden. I want you to have that again." Their first Christmas together was simple but joyful. They attended the Christmas Eve service at the church, with Thomas bundled warmly against the cold. On Christmas morning, Lucian gave Grace a beautiful leather-bound journal he had commissioned from the town's bookbinder. "For your recipes," he explained, "and your dreams. Martha tells me you want to open a restaurant someday. I thought you could use this to plan." Grace was so overcome she could not speak for a moment. She threw her arms around Lucian's neck and held him tightly. "Thank you," she finally managed, "for believing in me, for seeing me." "Always," Lucian promised. Grace gave him a thick wool scarf she had knitted in secret, working on it late at night after he had fallen asleep. "To keep you warm," she said, "because you gave me your coat that first night and I never want you to be cold because of me again." They spent the afternoon playing with Thomas, who was fascinated by the paper and ribbons even if he was too young to understand presents. Martha joined them for Christmas dinner, bringing a pie and her warm company. As winter deepened, life in Cripple Creek settled into a peaceful rhythm. Lucian continued working at the livery and took on additional work repairing wagons and doing carpentry. Grace helped Martha 3 days a week and spent the rest of her time caring for Thomas and planning her future restaurant. Thomas grew and thrived, becoming a happy, curious baby who seemed to smile at everyone. He clearly adored Lucian, reaching for him whenever he entered the room and laughing with delight when Lucian tossed him gently in the air. "He knows you are his father," Grace said one evening watching them play together. "Blood has nothing to do with it. You are his father in every way that matters." Lucian felt emotion tighten his throat. "I love him like he is my own," he said. "I love both of you more than I ever thought possible." As spring approached and the snow began to melt in the mountains, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Lucian one evening after putting Thomas to bed, her hands shaking slightly as she took his. "I am with child," she said simply. "We are going to have a baby." Lucian's face went through a series of emotions so quickly that Grace almost laughed. Shock, then joy, then concern. "Are you well?" he asked immediately. "Do you need to see the doctor? Should you stop working?" Grace did laugh then, pulling him close. "I am perfectly well, and I am not going to stop working, at least not yet. Women have babies while working all the time, Lucian." "But you are not just any woman," he insisted. "You are my wife, and I want to make sure you and the baby are safe." His protectiveness was endearing, and Grace kissed him softly. "We are safe," she assured him. "We have you, and we have a home, and we have a future. Everything is going to be wonderful." And it was. As Grace's belly grew with their child, Lucian became even more devoted and attentive. He took over many of her household chores and insisted she rest more. Martha was thrilled by the news and immediately began knitting baby clothes. Thomas was walking now, toddling around on unsteady legs and getting into everything. He was a happy child, full of laughter and curiosity. People in town often commented on what a lovely family they made, and Lucian felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. One warm day in May, when Grace was about 6 months along, she was working in her garden while Thomas played nearby under Lucian's watchful eye. She was planting tomatoes and beans, humming softly to herself. Lucian sat on the porch steps, mending a harness and stealing glances at his wife. "You look happy," he observed. Grace looked up with a smile, dirt on her hands and face flushed from the sun. "I am happy," she said simply. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible." She stood and walked over to him, and he pulled her down to sit beside him. "Do you remember that night you found us? When I had given up hope and thought Thomas and I would die out there in the cold?" "I remember," Lucian said quietly. "Sometimes I think about how different my life would be if you had not heard Thomas crying, if you had ridden past or been camped somewhere else. And then I think about how you did not just help us that night. You held Thomas until he slept. You stayed awake all night to keep us safe. You brought us here and made sure we had a chance." She took his hand and placed it on her rounded belly. "You gave us life, Lucian. Real life, not just survival. And now we are building something beautiful together." Lucian felt tears sting his eyes. "You gave me life too," he said. "Before I met you, I was just drifting, running from my past and not building toward any future. You and Thomas gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to put down roots and build something that lasts." They sat together on the porch steps, watching Thomas chase a butterfly through the garden, feeling their unborn child move beneath their joined hands. It was a perfect moment, simple and profound, the kind that makes up a life well lived. The baby came on a hot August night, arriving quickly and without complications. Grace labored through the evening with Martha and the town's midwife in attendance, while Lucian paced nervously outside with Thomas. When the first cry split the night air, Lucian's heart leaped into his throat. Martha emerged a few minutes later, beaming. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy baby boy, and Grace is doing wonderfully." Lucian rushed inside to find Grace propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle. She looked up as he entered, tears streaming down her face. "Look," she whispered. "Look at him, Lucian." The baby was so small, his face red and wrinkled, his tiny fists waving in the air. But he was perfect, absolutely perfect. Lucian sat carefully on the edge of the bed and put his arm around Grace, looking down at their son with awe. "What should we name him?" Grace asked softly. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his newborn son, Lucian knew exactly what he wanted to call him. "Samuel," he said. "If you agree, it was my father's name. He was a good man who died too young, but he taught me about honor and hard work. I would like our son to carry that forward." "Samuel Jameson," Grace said, testing the name. "It is perfect." She looked up at Lucian. "Would you like to hold your son?" With trembling hands, Lucian took the baby, cradling him carefully against his chest. Samuel blinked up at him with unfocused eyes, his tiny mouth working. Lucian felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "Hello, Samuel," he said softly. "Welcome to the world, little one. I am your father, and I promise to love you and protect you for as long as I live." Thomas, now 13 months old, was brought in to meet his baby brother. He was fascinated by the small bundle, reaching out to touch Samuel's hand with surprising gentleness. "Baba," he said, one of his few words. "Yes, that is your baby brother," Grace said, smoothing Thomas's dark hair. "You are going to be such a good big brother." The next few weeks were exhausting but joyful. Samuel was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in reasonable stretches. Thomas adjusted to his new sibling with typical toddler curiosity, sometimes jealous but mostly fascinated. Lucian juggled work with helping Grace care for both boys, and Martha dropped by almost daily with food and offers of assistance. As summer turned to fall and then winter again, their little family continued to thrive. Grace's dream of opening a restaurant began to take concrete shape. Several of the town's businessmen, impressed by her cooking at Martha's boarding house, approached her about leasing a building on Main Street. "It would be a significant undertaking," one of them explained. "But we believe Cripple Creek needs a proper restaurant, and you are the perfect person to run it." Grace was hesitant at first, worried about managing a business while caring for 2 small children, but Lucian encouraged her strongly. "You can do this," he insisted. "We will make it work together. I can help with the boys, and Martha has already said she would be happy to watch them when needed. This is your dream, Grace. Do not let it slip away." So in the spring of 1886, nearly 2 years after that cold November night when Lucian had first heard Thomas crying, Grace's restaurant opened its doors. It was called the Homestead, in honor of the life she had lost and the new one she had built. The restaurant served hearty, home-cooked meals at reasonable prices, and it was an instant success. Grace had a gift for creating a welcoming atmosphere. The restaurant became a gathering place for the community, somewhere people came not just for food but for conversation and connection. She hired 2 young women to help with serving and cleaning, and she paid them fairly, remembering what it was like to need work desperately. Lucian continued working at the livery but also helped at the restaurant when needed, doing repairs and managing the accounts. They made a good team, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. Thomas was now 2.5, a bundle of energy who loved helping his mother in the restaurant kitchen. Samuel was crawling everywhere, getting into everything with a mischievous grin that reminded Grace of Lucian. One evening in late summer, after the restaurant had closed and the boys were asleep, Grace and Lucian sat on their porch watching the stars come out. The air was warm and sweet with the scent of Grace's flowers. "You ever think about that night?" Grace asked quietly. "When you found us?" "All the time," Lucian admitted. "I think about how easily I could have missed hearing Thomas cry, how if I had camped somewhere else or if the wind had been blowing differently, our paths might never have crossed." "Fate," Grace said softly. "I like to think it was fate. That we were meant to find each other, meant to build this life together." "Whatever it was, I am grateful for it," Lucian said, pulling her close. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Jameson. You and our boys." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "I love you," she said. "More than I can ever put into words. You saved my life that night, but more than that, you gave me a reason to truly live again. You gave Thomas a father and me a partner. You believed in my dreams and helped me make them reality. I could not ask for more." Lucian kissed her deeply, pouring all his love and devotion into that moment. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Should we think about giving Thomas and Samuel a little sister or brother?" he asked with a teasing grin. Grace laughed and swatted his arm. "Give me a few more months at least. 2 boys under 3 is quite enough for now. Thank you very much." But her eyes were warm and full of promise. They both knew their family would continue to grow, that there would be more children and more adventures ahead. The years that followed were full and rich. Grace's restaurant continued to flourish, becoming the most popular dining establishment in Cripple Creek. She published a small cookbook of her recipes, which sold throughout the region. Lucian eventually became a partner in the livery stable, and together, he and Grace became respected members of the community. They had 3 more children over the next 6 years. A daughter named Elizabeth in 1887, another son named Peter in 1889, and finally another daughter, Ruth, in 1891. Their small cabin became too cramped, so Lucian built them a proper house with enough bedrooms for everyone and a large kitchen where Grace could test new recipes. Thomas grew into a thoughtful, responsible young man who helped care for his younger siblings and worked at the restaurant after school. He never knew that Lucian was not his biological father, and by the time he was old enough to understand such things, it simply did not matter. Lucian was his father in every way that counted. Samuel inherited his father's skill with animals and spent most of his free time at the livery stable. Elizabeth was quiet and artistic, always drawing or writing stories. Peter was the adventurous one, constantly getting into scrapes and keeping his parents on their toes. And Ruth, the baby, was spoiled by everyone and ruled the household with her sweet smile and iron will. Grace and Lucian's love only deepened with time. They still made time for each other despite the chaos of raising 5 children and running 2 businesses. They would steal moments alone, walking through town after the children were asleep, or sitting together on the porch in the early morning before the day began. On their 10th wedding anniversary in December of 1894, Lucian surprised Grace by buying the land where he had first found her and Thomas that cold November night. It was still remote and wild, but he brought her there on a clear winter day while Martha watched the children. "Why here?" Grace asked, looking around at the rocky terrain. "Because this is where our story began," Lucian said simply. "This is where I heard Thomas crying and everything in my life changed. I wanted to own this piece of ground to mark it somehow as important." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "What are you going to do with it?" "Nothing," Lucian said. "Just keep it. Preserve it. Maybe someday we can bring our grandchildren here and tell them the story of how their grandmother and I found each other against all odds." Grace threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. "I love you so much," she whispered. "After all these years, after everything we have been through, I love you more every single day." "And I love you," Lucian replied. "You are my heart, Grace. You always will be." They stood together in that cold, remote place, remembering the desperate woman and crying baby, the lonely cowboy who could not walk away. Remembering that moment of connection that had changed everything. As they rode back to Cripple Creek in the gathering dusk, Grace turned to Lucian. "Do you have any regrets?" she asked. "About leaving Kansas, about the life you might have had?" Lucian did not hesitate. "Not a single one," he said firmly. "Every choice I made, every twist and turn in the road led me to you, led me to our children and our life together. I would not change a thing." And he meant it with his whole heart. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of joys and sorrows. Martha died peacefully in her sleep in 1896, leaving her boarding house to Grace in her will. Grace sold the building, but kept Martha's rocking chair and quilt, treasured reminders of the woman who had given her a chance when she needed it most. Thomas married a schoolteacher named Alice when he was 21, and they gave Grace and Lucian their first grandchild, a girl named Martha, in honor of the woman who had helped bring them all together. Thomas took over management of the restaurant when Grace decided to scale back her hours, and he ran it with the same dedication and care his mother had shown. Samuel opened his own horse trading business and became known throughout the region for his skill and honesty. Elizabeth married a banker and moved to Denver, though she visited regularly with her growing family. Peter joined the Army for a few years before returning to Cripple Creek to work as a deputy sheriff. Ruth, their baby, became a teacher and never married, devoting herself to educating the children of Cripple Creek. Through it all, Grace and Lucian remained the center of their family, the foundation on which everything was built. They grew old together gracefully, their hair turning gray, their faces lined with years of laughter and love. Grace's restaurant became a legacy, a place where multiple generations gathered. The house Lucian built became the gathering place for holidays and celebrations, always full of children and grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. On a cold November evening in 1914, exactly 30 years after that night when Lucian had first heard Thomas crying, Grace and Lucian sat together on their porch wrapped in quilts. They were in their 60s now, their children grown and scattered, but they still made time for these quiet moments together. 30 years, Grace marveled, leaning against Lucian's shoulder. "It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. You remember how terrified you were?" Lucian asked gently. "How you sat there in the cold, certain you and Thomas were going to die." "I remember," Grace said softly. "And I remember seeing you appear out of the darkness like an answer to a prayer I had not even known to say. I remember thinking you had the kindest eyes I had ever seen. I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I had ever met," Lucian replied. The way you held Thomas, the way you refused to give up even though you were at the end of your strength. I fell in love with you that night, even though I did not recognize it yet." Grace smiled and turned to kiss him softly. "We built something good, did we not? Despite everything we went through, despite how hard it was sometimes, we built something that will last." "We did," Lucian agreed. "We built a family. We built businesses and friendships and a life that matters. And we did it together." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Lucian thought about that long-ago night, about the choice he had made to investigate the crying instead of ignoring it. Such a small decision, really, but it had changed the entire course of his life. "Thank you," he said suddenly. Grace looked up at him with surprise. "For what?" "For letting me hold Thomas that first night," Lucian said. "For trusting me with your son when you had no reason to trust anyone. For letting me into your life and making me part of your family. For loving me and building this life with me. For everything." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. "Oh, Lucian, I am the one who should be thanking you. You saved us. You gave us everything." "No," Lucian said firmly, cupping her face in his weathered hands. "You gave me everything. Before you, I was alone and lost, running from my past with no future to run toward. You gave me purpose and love and a reason to build something lasting. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Jameson, and I thank God every day that I heard your baby crying that cold November night." They held each other close as the stars wheeled overhead and the cold wind whispered through the mountains. Somewhere inside the house, they could hear the sound of their grandchildren playing. A new generation carrying forward the love and legacy Grace and Lucian had built. When they finally went inside, hand in hand like they had been for 30 years, Thomas was waiting with his family. "Mother, father," he said, using the titles he had always used for them both. "We wanted to be here on this anniversary. We know it is the night you met, the night our family truly began." Grace looked around at the room full of her children and grandchildren, all gathered to celebrate the love story that had started in desperation and darkness. "It was not just the night we met," she said softly. "It was the night we were saved, all of us." And as the family gathered around to hear the story they had heard countless times before, but never tired of hearing, Grace and Lucian held hands and remembered. Remembered the cold and the crying and the moment when a lonely cowboy had made the choice to help a desperate woman and her baby. Remembered how that single act of compassion had blossomed into a love that had sustained them through 3 decades of life on the frontier. It was a story of survival and hope, of love found in the darkest moment and nurtured into something beautiful and lasting. It was their story, the foundation of everything they had built together. And it would be told and retold through the generations, a reminder that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come from the simplest acts of kindness. As Grace and Lucian lay in bed that night, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for 30 years, Lucian whispered the words that had become their private refrain. "I will hold him till he sleeps." Grace smiled against his chest. "And you did," she whispered back. "You held us all and kept us safe, and you always will." They fell asleep that way, together as they had been through 3 decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. And in the morning, they would wake to another day of the life they had built together, a life that had started with a baby's cry in the cold November night and a cowboy who refused to walk away. The years that remained to them were golden ones, filled with the love of family and the satisfaction of a life well lived. When Lucian finally passed away in 1922 at the age of 70, it was peacefully in his sleep with Grace holding his hand. She followed him just 6 months later, unable and unwilling to live without her partner and love. They were buried side by side in the Cripple Creek Cemetery, their headstones simple but bearing an inscription that told their whole story. He heard her baby cry and gave them both a home. Thomas, now 53 years old and a grandfather himself, stood at their graves with his siblings and told the story one more time to his grandchildren. The story of how their great-grandfather had heard a baby crying in the cold November night and had made the choice to help. How he had held that baby until he slept, and in doing so had built a family and a legacy that would endure for generations. Never forget, Thomas told the children gathered around him. Never forget that small acts of kindness can change the world. Never forget that love can bloom even in the darkest circumstances. And never forget that family is not always about blood. Sometimes it is about the choice to love and protect and nurture, just as Lucian chose to do for my mother and me that night so long ago. The children nodded solemnly, taking in the story and the lesson. And as they walked away from the graves, heading back to the house that Lucian had built and that still stood strong and welcoming, they carried with them the legacy of Grace and Lucian Jameson. A legacy of love and compassion, of strength and perseverance, of a family built on the foundation of a cowboy's kindness and a mother's desperate hope. The restaurant still operated on Main Street, now run by Thomas's daughter, serving the same recipes Grace had perfected over the years. The livery stable had been converted to a garage, but it still bore the Jameson name. The house was home to 4 generations now, with Thomas and Alice presiding over a sprawling family that gathered every holiday and special occasion. And on cold November nights, when the wind howled through the mountains and the stars shone bright overhead, the family would gather around the fire and tell the story again. The story of how Grace Evans had been found half frozen in the wilderness with her crying baby. How Lucian Jameson had heard that cry and made the choice to help. How he had held the baby until he slept, and in doing so had changed the course of all their lives. It was a story of the American West, of hardship and survival, of the bonds that form between people in the face of adversity. But more than that, it was a love story. A story of 2 people who found each other in the darkness and built something beautiful and lasting together. A story that would be told and retold as long as the Jameson family endured. A reminder that love can bloom anywhere, even in the cold November night when a baby cries and a cowboy says, "I will hold him till he sleeps." And in the end, that was the greatest legacy Grace and Lucian left behind. Not the businesses or the property or even the large family they had created, but the simple truth that love, real and lasting love, can transform lives and create something that endures long after we are gone. That a single moment of compassion and connection can ripple forward through generations, changing the world in ways we can never fully know or measure. The story of Grace and Lucian Jameson was that kind of story, and it would never be forgotten.